At first, it didn't look like anything special. No emergency meeting. No league-wide announcement. No commissioner stepping in front of cameras to calm people down. Just another off-season. Or at least that's how it was supposed to feel. But for anyone paying close attention, something was off. The conversations sounded different. The timing felt wrong. And the decisions being made didn't match the explanations being given. What was unfolding wasn't about basketball strategy or roster depth. It was about something much more dangerous to an established system. Speed. Because once a league loses control of the pace, it loses control of the story. The WNBA has spent decades learning how to manage growth without chaos. Attention was welcomed, but only when it arrived in predictable waves. Stars were promoted, but never allowed to eclipse the structure. The league survived by staying balanced, measured, and careful. That approach worked when the sport was growing slowly. It doesn't work when growth shows up fully formed, already monetized, and impossible to contain. That's what made this moment different. Caitlin Clark didn't enter the league asking permission. She arrived with leverage, visibility, and a financial gravity that bent everything around her. Fans followed. Cameras followed. Sponsors followed. And suddenly, the league was no longer setting the terms of engagement. It was responding to them. Most people focused on the noise. The debates. The fouls. The commentary. The rookie records. But the real story wasn't happening on the court. It was happening in how fast organizations were forced to choose sides. Adapt immediately or fall behind. Protect the system or protect the asset. Maintain tradition or chase momentum. The Indiana Fever didn't hesitate. While others tried to slow the moment down, Indiana leaned into it. Quietly at first, then decisively. And by the time the public realized what was happening, the direction was already set. This wasn't about building a team over 5 years. This was about seizing a window that might only stay open for one. Because in modern sports, attention doesn't wait. Money doesn't wait. And stars with global reach don't wait for institutions to get comfortable. What happens next isn't just going to define a franchise. It's going to force the entire league to confront a question it's been avoiding for a long time. What do you do when the future arrives faster than your rules were designed to handle? There is a specific moment when a franchise stops pretending it's patient. It doesn't happen in public. It happens internally, when leadership realizes that the language of rebuilding no longer matches the reality on the ground. That moment arrived for the Indiana Fever much sooner than anyone expected. And when it did, it forced them to make a choice that most rebuilding teams never make this early. Slow down and protect stability, or speed up and chase dominance. 4 years, Indiana lived in the safe zone of the WNBA. Lottery picks. Development seasons. Incremental progress framed as long-term vision. Losing was tolerated because the future was always the justification. That mindset creates comfort. It buys time. But it also creates inertia. And inertia becomes dangerous when circumstances change faster than your plan. Caitlin Clark changed the circumstances overnight. The Fever didn't just draft a player. They inherited an audience. Ticket demand exploded. National broadcasts followed. Media scrutiny intensified. Every game became content. Every possession became a clip. Suddenly, Indiana wasn't a quiet rebuild anymore. It was the center of the league's attention. That kind of spotlight doesn't wait for development timelines. It demands results, clarity, and intention. The problem was obvious to anyone inside the building. The organization was operating like a team learning to win, while the world was treating them like a flagship franchise. That disconnect creates pressure that rosters and coaching staffs feel immediately. Every inefficiency gets magnified. Every loss feels louder. Every internal disagreement carries higher stakes. And that's when Indiana stopped being polite. The decision to move on from Christie's sides shocked people precisely because it violated the league's unwritten rules. Coaches who take struggling teams to the playoffs usually earn security, not scrutiny. Improvement is supposed to buy patience. Progress is supposed to matter. But that logic only applies when expectations are modest. Indiana's expectations were no longer modest. From a distance, the firing looked harsh. From inside the front office, it was inevitable. The Fever weren't evaluating the past season in isolation. They were projecting forward and realizing something uncomfortable. The system they were running wasn't built for the scale of attention now attached to their roster. The pace was wrong. The ceiling felt artificial. And the margin for error had evaporated. In the Caitlin Clark era, good enough became a liability. This wasn't about wins and losses anymore. It was about opportunity cost. Every possession that didn't maximize Clark's strengths felt like wasted value. Every scheme that slowed the game felt like resistance against momentum. And every season spent adjusting gradually felt like time slipping away while the rest of the sports world leaned in. That's the part casual fans rarely see. Franchises don't just compete on the court. They compete for relevance, for leverage, for future positioning. Indiana realized they were sitting on the most powerful attention engine the league had ever seen. Treating that like a normal rebuild would have been organizational malpractice. So the Fever made a decision that signaled a fundamental shift in identity. They weren't interested in being a feel-good story about growth anymore. They wanted control. Control of pace. Control of narrative. Control of outcomes. And that required dismantling anything that wasn't aligned with acceleration. The message wasn't subtle. It was cold and clear. The franchise had entered a new phase, and survival in that phase required urgency. Loyalty to past success no longer mattered. Comfort was gone. Stability was negotiable. Everything was now measured against one question. Does this move push us closer to domination, or does it slow us down? Once that question becomes the standard, the entire organization changes. Players feel it. Coaches feel it. The league feels it. Indiana wasn't rebuilding anymore. They were racing the clock. And they were willing to make enemies to do it. If firing the coach was the warning shot, the replacement choice was the confirmation. Indiana didn't shop for comfort. They didn't look for a caretaker. They didn't hire someone who would continue the process or protect existing relationships. They made a hire that immediately clarified their priorities, and in doing so, they removed any remaining doubt about what kind of franchise they were trying to become. Stephanie White wasn't a neutral decision. This wasn't about finding a competent basketball mind. The league has plenty of those. This was about alignment, authority, and speed. White arrives with credibility that doesn't need seasoning and a reputation that doesn't need explanation. She's coached at the highest level. She understands pressure environments. And she doesn't carry the insecurity that comes with being overwhelmed by a superstar's gravitational pull. That matters more than people realize. When a franchise lands a player with unprecedented attention, the most dangerous thing it can do is pair them with leadership that still needs to find its footing. Coaches either bend under that pressure or learn how to weaponize it. Indiana chose someone who had already been through the fire. The hire signaled something subtle but important. The Fever were done asking Caitlin Clark to adjust to the league's tempo. They were done softening her game to fit existing structures. Instead, they committed to building an environment that amplifies chaos rather than suppressing it. White's coaching philosophy fits that vision almost too cleanly. Her offenses move fast. They thrive on space, pace, and decision-making under pressure. They don't wait for perfect possessions. They create discomfort, then exploit it. That style isn't just entertaining. It's exhausting for defenses. And when you have a player who can stretch the floor the moment she crosses half-court, exhaustion becomes a weapon. Indiana understood this. They weren't just hiring a coach. They were installing a system designed to force the rest of the league to react. This is where the shift becomes impossible to ignore. Most rookies spend their first seasons learning how to survive, adjusting to physicality, navigating defensive schemes, figuring out when to assert themselves and when to blend in. Indiana skipped that phase entirely. By making this hire, they effectively announced that the adjustment period was over. The system would now bend around the player, not the other way around. That's a dangerous precedent in a league built on balance. Defensive coordinators across the WNBA already struggled to contain Clark when she was operating inside a structure that wasn't fully optimized for her strengths. Indiana looked at that reality and decided containment wasn't the goal anymore. Overload was. The implications of that decision extend far beyond Indiana. When one franchise stops playing by the league's unofficial rhythm, it forces everyone else to respond. Games speed up. Rotations tighten. Physicality increases. Officiating gets strained. And resentment quietly builds. White's arrival isn't just about wins. It's about forcing the league into a faster, less comfortable version of itself. That's why this hire landed differently. It told veterans, coaches, and executives something they weren't ready to hear. Indiana isn't interested in earning approval. They're interested in setting terms. And they're willing to pay a premium to do it. The most revealing part of this move isn't what it says about coaching. It's what it says about trust. By bringing in someone with this level of authority, the Fever made it clear that they trust Clark's game enough to let it define the system. That's not development. That's delegation of power. And once power starts shifting from institution to individual, the entire ecosystem starts to feel unstable. Indiana didn't just hire a coach. They hired a facilitator for a new order. One where pace replaces patience, where ceilings are pushed aggressively, and where the margin for tolerance disappears. And while this coaching decision was reshaping the identity of the franchise on the court, something else was happening off it that would make everything even more volatile. The coaching hire alone would have been enough to signal a shift. But it wasn't the move that destabilized the league. That came from a number that landed without warning and instantly reframed everything around it. $28 million. That figure didn't just circulate through sports media. It echoed through front offices, locker rooms, agent calls, and boardrooms. Not because endorsement deals are new, but because this one arrived out of sequence. This wasn't a veteran cashing in after years of dominance. This wasn't a championship resume being rewarded. This was a rookie entering the professional ranks with a financial footprint that dwarfed the structure she had just joined. The league wasn't prepared for that contrast. For decades, the WNBA operated within a tightly controlled economic ecosystem. Salaries were modest. Marketing budgets were cautious. Star power existed, but it rarely translated into transformational money. The deal Caitlin Clark signed didn't fit inside that framework. It exploded outside of it. And once that happens, everything built on the old scale starts to look fragile. This wasn't a sponsorship. It was a coronation. The implications go far beyond personal wealth. When an athlete signs a deal of that magnitude, they stop being just a player. They become a platform. They become a revenue engine with interests that extend beyond team success. And most importantly, they become independent of the league's financial leverage. That's the part that makes executives uneasy. In most professional sports, teams and leagues hold power because they control opportunity, playing time, exposure, paychecks. When an athlete's income is tied primarily to the organization, compliance is easy to enforce. But when the majority of that income comes from outside the league, the balance shifts. Pressure tactics weaken. Control mechanisms soften. And decision-making becomes a negotiation rather than a directive. Clark's deal didn't just raise eyebrows. It forced a recalculation. Suddenly, conversations about development, patience, and long-term growth sounded outdated. You don't slow-roll an asset that valuable. You don't bury it in systems that minimize its reach. You maximize it, protect it, and build infrastructure around it as quickly as possible. Indiana understood that immediately. And so did everyone else watching. What makes this deal especially disruptive is timing. The league is still in the middle of redefining its commercial identity. Media rights are evolving. Viewership is climbing. Sponsors are paying closer attention than ever. And into that transitional moment steps a player whose individual market value threatens to outpace the collective framework. That kind of imbalance doesn't just create excitement. It creates anxiety. Because once one player proves the ceiling is higher than advertised, everyone else starts asking why they're still operating under old assumptions. The number also shattered a long-standing illusion. The idea that professional success must precede financial reward. Clark inverted that order. Her value was already established before she ever played a professional minute. That reality challenges how legitimacy has traditionally been measured in the league. And challenges like that don't land softly. There's another layer that makes this even more volatile. The money didn't just arrive quietly. It arrived with intention, with long-term commitment, with plans that extend far beyond highlight clips and short-term hype. Deals structured this way aren't built around flashes. They're built around belief. Belief that the player isn't just popular, but durable. Not just exciting, but foundational. That belief carries weight. When corporations make bets this large, they expect ecosystems to adapt around them. Schedules matter. Exposure matters. Narratives matter. And suddenly, league decisions that once felt neutral begin to feel political. Every officiating call, every marketing choice, every primetime slot becomes part of a larger conversation about alignment. This is where tension quietly begins to build. Veterans look at the number and feel the disparity. Executives look at it and feel pressure. The league looks at it and sees opportunity mixed with risk. And the player at the center of it all becomes both the engine of growth and the focal point of unease. Indiana didn't shy away from this reality. They leaned into it. They understood that once this level of money enters the picture, pretending the playing field is level becomes impossible. The only viable strategy is to acknowledge the imbalance and build around it faster than resentment can calcify. But the most explosive part of the deal wasn't the total value. It was what came attached to it. In basketball culture, a signature shoe is never just footwear. It's hierarchy made visible. It's a public declaration of who matters, who moves markets, and who commands attention beyond the court. In men's basketball, that hierarchy has been established for decades. In the WNBA, it has always been different. Rarer. Slower. Earned through years of dominance, championships, and cultural impact layered over time. That's why this moment landed the way it did. A rookie receiving a signature shoe before ever settling into professional life doesn't just raise eyebrows. It disrupts an entire order that many players spent their careers navigating. Legends waited years. MVPs waited years. Champions waited years. And suddenly, the line was skipped. That isn't just uncommon. It's destabilizing. The shoe instantly placed Caitlin Clark into a category that usually takes a decade to reach. Not because of longevity, not because of titles, but because of reach. And reach is the one currency that can't be coached, transferred, or contained once it exists. This is where the narrative fracture begins. For supporters, the shoe felt inevitable. A reflection of demand. A response to sold-out arenas and record-breaking viewership. For critics, it felt premature. A corporate overreach that rewarded hype before accomplishment. Both reactions can exist at the same time, and that tension is exactly what makes the moment volatile. Because the shoe doesn't just represent belief in Clark. It represents a reordering of relevance. Every time she steps on the court wearing it, the message is unavoidable. This player is being marketed as the face of the future, regardless of where she stands in the league's traditional pecking order. That visual reminder follows opponents through warm-ups, possessions, and post-game interviews. It's not subtle, and it isn't neutral. Insiders have quietly hinted that the process moved faster than usual. Design timelines compressed. Launch strategies aligned with peak visibility. Nothing officially confirmed. Nothing explicitly denied. Just enough chatter to fuel the sense that this wasn't business as usual. It felt urgent, purposeful, like a window was being seized before it could close. That urgency matters. When companies rush products to market, it's because momentum is fragile. Attention fades. Narratives shift. And when you're betting on cultural dominance, timing can matter more than perfection. The risk, of course, is that speed invites scrutiny. Design choices get dissected. Comparisons get brutal. And expectations inflate instantly. If the shoe succeeds, it validates the decision to fast-track the moment. If it stumbles, it becomes ammunition for critics who already believe the rise came too quickly. Either way, the player becomes the focal point of a debate that has very little to do with basketball. This is the burden of being elevated early. The shoe also exposes an uncomfortable truth about the modern sports economy. Marketability doesn't wait for permission. It responds to demand. And demand doesn't care about seniority. It cares about attention, engagement, and conversion. Clark dominates those metrics in ways that can't be ignored, no matter how much it challenges tradition. That reality doesn't sit well in environments built on shared struggle. For players who endured years of commercial flights, limited exposure, and capped earning potential, watching a rookie leapfrog into rarefied air is jarring. It forces comparisons that feel unfair but unavoidable. It turns success into a zero-sum perception problem, where one player's rise feels like another's erasure. The signature shoe becomes the symbol of that imbalance. It's not about rubber and laces. It's about visibility and value. It's about who the world sees when it looks at the league, and who it overlooks in the process. And once that symbol exists, there's no pretending it doesn't. Indiana understands this dynamic intimately. They know the shoe puts pressure on Clark. They know it intensifies scrutiny. They also know it locks her into a role that can't be walked back. You don't quietly exist when your name is on a product meant to define a generation. You become the reference point for everything that follows. That's why the franchise isn't hedging. They aren't trying to soften the moment or downplay the symbolism. They're building infrastructure to support it. Coaches, systems, protection, messaging. Everything is being aligned around the understanding that the spotlight isn't temporary. It's structural. And when a player becomes structural to the business, the relationship between league, team, and athlete changes permanently. The signature shoe didn't just elevate Caitlin Clark. It forced everyone else to confront where they stand. The most destabilizing part of this entire situation isn't the shoe, the coach, or even the attention. It's the moment when money stops functioning the way it's supposed to inside a professional league. For decades, leverage in the WNBA was simple. Teams controlled opportunity. Playing time led to exposure. Exposure led to endorsements. And endorsements followed performance. That sequence created a clean power structure. If you wanted more, you needed the league. If you wanted visibility, you needed the system to cooperate. That sequence no longer applies here. Caitlin Clark's income is no longer tethered to her WNBA contract in any meaningful way. The league paycheck, while symbolically important, isn't what sustains her career. It isn't what funds her future. And it isn't what determines her security. That reality changes how every decision around her must be handled. When a player depends on the league financially, pressure works. Minutes can be adjusted. Roles can be negotiated. Expectations can be enforced. But when a player's primary income exists entirely outside that structure, pressure becomes suggestion. Authority becomes conversation. And discipline becomes delicate. This is what executives quietly fear. Because once one player demonstrates that independence is possible, the system's ability to self-regulate weakens. You can't threaten what you don't control. You can't slow what you don't fund. And you can't dictate behavior when the consequences don't carry real weight. Clark doesn't need to rush back from injury to protect a contract. She doesn't need to accept unfavorable roles to preserve endorsements. She doesn't need to stay silent to remain marketable. Her brand is already built. The infrastructure around her exists whether the league is comfortable with it or not. That creates a new category of athlete. Not a star. Not a franchise player. But a partner with options. From Indiana's perspective, this reality is both empowering and terrifying. Empowering, because they know their centerpiece isn't distracted by financial insecurity. Terrifying, because they know they can't rely on traditional levers to manage risk. Every conversation becomes higher stakes when walking away is a viable option. And walking away doesn't have to mean leaving the sport. This is where the ecosystem starts to feel crowded. Alternate leagues. Off-season opportunities. International play. Short-form competitions. Media ventures. All of them become realistic considerations when money isn't the limiting factor. The league stops being the only place where value can be realized, and that's when exclusivity erodes. Clark's situation forces Indiana to operate differently. They can't simply protect their asset by restricting movement or issuing directives. They have to persuade. They have to align incentives. They have to create an environment so compelling that choosing anything else feels like a downgrade, not an opportunity. That's a fragile balance. Because persuasion requires trust, and trust requires transparency. And transparency becomes harder when the spotlight never turns off. Every decision feels scrutinized. Every delay feels intentional. Every silence invites speculation. The league as a whole feels this pressure too. If one player can operate independently, others will start asking what it would take to do the same. Not everyone can replicate Clark's reach, but the ceiling has been exposed. The myth of inevitability has been broken. And once athletes see that the system isn't the only path to stability, loyalty becomes conditional. That's not rebellion. That's rational behavior. The irony is that Clark's independence makes her both powerful and vulnerable. Powerful because she has options. Vulnerable because every choice she makes gets interpreted through that lens. If she speaks up, it's leverage. If she stays quiet, it's strategy. If she explores alternatives, it's framed as threat. Indiana knows this dynamic is unavoidable. That's why they're moving with urgency. They understand that keeping Clark engaged isn't just about winning games. It's about offering clarity. About showing her a future that feels intentional, ambitious, and aligned with her momentum. Because when the paycheck stops being leverage, purpose becomes the currency. And that's a currency that's much harder to control. This is where the situation stops being theoretical and becomes genuinely uncomfortable for everyone involved. Because once a player reaches financial independence, the next question isn't how much they make. It's how many places they can make it. And that question is now hovering over Indiana's offseason like a storm cloud that refuses to move. The emergence of alternative leagues has always been treated as background noise. Experimental formats. Off-season distractions. Interesting ideas that rarely threaten the core structure of the sport. That perception changes the moment one of those leagues can offer something the primary league cannot. Freedom paired with real money. The unrivaled league represents that shift. On paper, it's just a high-speed, short-season, offense-heavy concept designed to attract fans during the WNBA offseason. In reality, it's a stress test for the league's authority. Because if a star of Clark's magnitude chooses to participate, it legitimizes the model instantly. Attention follows. Sponsors follow. And suddenly, what was supposed to be supplemental starts looking competitive. The rumors surrounding Clark's potential involvement have been deliberate and quiet. No confirmations. No denials. Just enough information leaking out to keep the conversation alive. Speculation about massive short-term paydays. Whispers of creative compensation structures. Suggestions that participation wouldn't just be about salary, but about influence. Whether all of that is accurate almost doesn't matter. What matters is that it's plausible. That plausibility forces Indiana into its first real power negotiation with its franchise player. And it's a negotiation they can't win outright. If they block participation, they risk signaling control rather than partnership. If they allow it, they assume injury risk that could derail everything they're building before it even starts. This is the nightmare scenario for management. Protecting the asset is the logical move. But protection can feel like restriction when the player doesn't need the money and doesn't need permission. At the same time, allowing participation opens the door to criticism if anything goes wrong. A rolled ankle becomes a referendum. A missed game becomes a headline. A shortened season becomes a failure of leadership. There is no clean outcome. What makes this even more volatile is the physical toll Clark is already carrying. She didn't ease into professional basketball. She sprinted. Heavy minutes. Defensive attention every possession. Little margin for rest. Adding a high-intensity off-season league to that workload isn't just a business decision. It's a medical gamble with consequences that extend far beyond one calendar year. And yet, from Clark's perspective, The logic is different. Playing keeps momentum alive. It maintains visibility. It reinforces her role as the center of gravity in women's basketball. Sitting out, even for valid reasons, invites narratives she doesn't control. Questions about commitment. Questions about competitiveness. Questions about whether she's leveraging her power rather than embracing the grind. The silence from her camp isn't accidental. It's strategic. By not committing publicly, Clark preserves optionality. Every week the question remains unanswered, her leverage grows. Indiana waits. The league waits. Media fills the gap. Attention stays locked in. This is what modern power looks like. Not declarations. Not ultimatums. Just patience. But patience cuts both ways. The longer the decision lingers, the more pressure builds internally. Coaches need to plan workloads. Trainers need clarity. Front offices need risk models. Uncertainty becomes expensive when everything else is moving fast. This situation is the first moment where Indiana has to prove that its aggressive posture isn't just about dominance, but about relationship management. They can't bully their way through this. They can't spin it away. They have to navigate it carefully, because how they handle this choice will define trust moving forward. This is the first true test of the new era. Not a game. Not a hire. Not a deal. But a decision that reveals whether this partnership is built on alignment or convenience. Whether acceleration comes with collaboration or control. The league is watching closely. Because if Indiana fails this test, it sends a message that power shifts faster than institutions can adapt. And if they succeed, it proves something far more dangerous for the old order. That the center of gravity has already moved. The timing wasn't accidental. When the Players Association opted out of the collective bargaining agreement earlier than expected, the league framed it as a routine business decision. Forward-thinking. Strategic. Necessary for long-term sustainability. That's how labor moves are always described publicly. Calm language. Neutral tone. No villains. No catalysts. But inside the league, everyone understood what had changed. The math no longer made sense. 4 years, revenue discussions were theoretical. Growth was incremental. Projections were cautious. The league could justify modest salaries and slow increases because the financial ceiling felt distant. That illusion collapsed the moment a single player began generating measurable economic impact in real time. Ticket prices surged. Merchandise vanished. Broadcast interest spiked. Sponsors didn't just inquire, they committed. And suddenly, the old revenue-sharing logic looked outdated before the ink even dried. This is where Clark's influence becomes unavoidable, even when it isn't named. The union didn't opt out because of one endorsement deal. It opted out because the league's financial ecosystem shifted faster than the agreement was built to handle. Clark didn't just bring attention. She accelerated timelines. She forced everyone to confront a future that had arrived early and demanded renegotiation. That's uncomfortable for institutions. Because collective bargaining agreements are designed for predictability, stability, gradual evolution. They are not designed to absorb shocks. And Clark represents a shock. A disruption that exposes how much value had been sitting dormant, waiting for the right trigger. Players understand this instinctively. They see the sold-out arenas. They see the broadcast ratings. They see the corporate interest flooding in. And they ask the only rational question. If the money is here now, why are we still being paid like it isn't? That question doesn't come from envy. Comes from awareness. The paradox is that Clark's presence benefits everyone while simultaneously intensifying competition. The pie is getting bigger, but the slice hierarchy is being reordered. Veterans know that revenue growth strengthens their negotiating position. They also know that attention isn't being distributed evenly. That tension creates a strange emotional landscape. Gratitude and resentment coexist. Appreciation for the growth sits alongside frustration over visibility. Players understand that Clark is expanding the league's footprint. They also feel the pressure of being compared to her constantly, measured against standards that didn't exist before she arrived. The union's move amplifies that pressure. Negotiations are no longer just about fairness. They're about timing. About making sure this moment isn't squandered. About locking in gains before attention shifts elsewhere. And in that race, urgency replaces patience. League leadership feels it. Every public statement now carries weight. Every delay gets interpreted as resistance. Every compromise becomes precedent. The opt-out forces the league into a reactive posture at the exact moment it would prefer control. And that's the through line of this entire era. Control slipping. Clark didn't ask to become the symbol of labor acceleration, but symbols don't need consent. They emerge when conditions align. Her success made it impossible to argue that the league's growth was hypothetical. It put numbers on momentum. It turned projections into receipts. That's why negotiations will feel tense. Because once players believe the ceiling has moved, they won't accept explanations built on the old one. And once management recognizes that attention can't be throttled, they lose the ability to slow the process down. This is how revolutions start in professional sports. Not with protests. With spreadsheets that no longer add up. Indiana understands this better than most. They know their franchise player isn't just changing their organization. She's changing the bargaining environment for everyone. That makes her valuable, but it also makes her a lightning rod. And lightning rods don't just attract energy. They attract impact. The league can't avoid this conversation anymore. The numbers are too loud. Every shift in power creates resistance. And in sports, resistance rarely shows up as silence. It shows up as contact, as scrutiny, as moments that feel a little harder than they need to be. The league doesn't have to say anything out loud for the message to be delivered. Players feel it in how they're guarded. Coaches feel it in how games are officiated. Front offices feel it in how narratives form around wins and losses. Caitlin Clark didn't just step into a league. She stepped into an ecosystem that wasn't built to process a single player becoming this central, this fast. That's why the conversation around her has grown sharper. Hard fouls get justified as welcome to the league. Physicality gets reframed as toughness. Dismissive comments get packaged as wisdom. None of it exists in isolation. It's a response to imbalance. When one player represents attention, money, and momentum, guarding her becomes symbolic. It's not just defense. It's assertion. Veterans aren't just protecting their spots. They're protecting a hierarchy they spent years navigating. Indiana sees this clearly. They watched last season unfold. They saw moments where whistles stayed silent. They saw the emotional temperature rise. They saw how quickly admiration can turn into irritation when the spotlight doesn't rotate. And they adjusted accordingly. The off-season strategy wasn't just about shooting and spacing. It was about insulation, protection. That's why roster conversations have shifted in tone. Speed matters, but so does physical presence. Shooting matters, but so does deterrence. The Fever aren't just building a contender. They're building a buffer. An understanding that if you're going to center your franchise around the most visible player in the league, you can't leave her exposed to the league's collective frustration. This is where the super team perception begins. Money, attention, aggressive decision-making. These are the ingredients that turn a franchise into a villain overnight. And Indiana isn't running from that label. They're leaning into it. They know what comes with it. They know being liked isn't the goal. Control is. Historically, teams that embrace this role move fast or collapse fast. There's no middle ground. Windows close quickly. Injuries happen. Momentum fades. Indiana's leadership understands that waiting for consensus is the same as surrendering leverage. They're operating as if the championship window is open right now, not 5 years from now. That pressure doesn't just land on the front office. It lands on Clark. Expectations escalate brutally fast when you're framed as the future. Rookie seasons don't buy grace. Growth curves get ignored. Every slump gets magnified. Every mistake gets clipped and replayed. The jump from promising star to assumed MVP happens without negotiation. That's the cost of the check that was cashed. Nike expects dominance. The franchise expects results. Fans expect transformation. None of those expectations pause for adjustment. And the mental load of carrying that weight can't be measured in minutes or points. It shows up in endurance, in recovery, in how long someone can stay sharp while being watched from every angle. There's also a deeper ripple effect that hasn't fully surfaced yet. Young players are watching this closely. High school prospects, college stars, nil collectives, agents. Everyone is recalibrating what's possible. The Clark blueprint is becoming the new reference point. Logo range shots. Personal brands built early. Leverage before longevity. The Fever understand they aren't just selling tickets anymore. They're selling participation in a moment. A cultural shift. An entry point into the future of women's basketball. That's why prices rise. That's why merchandise disappears. That's why every decision feels amplified. And it's why the league feels tense. Because once a future arrives early, there's no resetting expectations. The only question left is whether the system adapts smoothly or fractures under the pressure. If you made it this far, you're not here for highlights. You're here for context. This channel breaks down what's happening behind the headlines. The power shifts, the business decisions, the leverage plays that actually shape the league. If you want more deep dives like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown. Tap like to tell the algorithm this is the kind of analysis you want more of. And leave a comment with your take, because the debate around this era is only getting louder, and your perspective matters. The future of the WNBA isn't coming. It's already here.